Hi, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. And I want to commend you for all that you're doing as a church, for all that you're continuing to do. I want to thank you for your prayers, for your generosity. And I want to remind you all again, we're going to get through this. I think it was Winston Churchill who said during the darkest days of World War II, remember when you're going through hell, to keep going. The psalmist put it this way, that even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. This week commemorates the beginning of Holy Week. Palm Sunday, the day we remember the events which culminate with Good Friday and that victorious first resurrection morning. I suspect this is going to be an Easter Sunday none of us will ever forget. Some people outside of the church have said things to me like, Pastor, this has got to be hard for you. I even heard one rabbi say that people have been coming up to him and saying, how disappointing it must be to celebrate the Passover, not to celebrate the Passover at this time of year. I appreciate and understand those sentiments. I appreciate how different our celebration of Holy Week is going to be this year. I am going to miss the sunrise service, the breakfast, the celebration that follows. And I have to acknowledge, as I heard one pastor say this week, that this present crisis, with all of the sickness, all of the fear, all of the isolation, the prospect of death actually heightens the meaning of the events we remember on this week. So Passover, which happens on Thursday, celebrates a time in the history of the Jewish people when God passed over the despair and the slavery of his people in Egypt, when he passed over the angel of death that afflicted his people's tormentors, when he passed over the Red Sea, when he passed over the desert, and when God's people passed over the Jordan River and finally made it into the Promised Land. And then there is, of course, the story of Jesus and the events of Holy Week, where we remember that Jesus passed over, right? Passed through the torture, passed over and through the rejection, passed over the denial by Peter and the defection of his closest followers, where we remember how he passed over the temptation to despair, when he passed over all that hell could throw at him on Good Friday, and how he passed through the very gates of hell to bring us into the light and the life of that first Easter morning. So just as the Jews passed through the events of their history, and just as Jesus passed through the events of Holy Week, we're reminded that we are going to pass through the events of these days as well. Look at somebody next to you and say, we're going to pass through. So we stand confidently in those truths this morning. We remember that those Passovers, the Passover of the Jewish nation and the Passover of Jesus, were far from easy. To get to the other side of those events, there were dark days of doubt, of anguish, of conflict, of danger, of risk, of setback, of adversity. They're what I like to call Garden of Gethsemane moments. Some of you have been through them this week. But in the end of those stories, and in the end of our stories, God came through, and he will come through once again. I heard a rabbi saying this week, imagine the Passover services canceled because of a plague. When has that ever happened? And then he said this, we've been there before. So I want you to remember not to lose heart. God is with us this morning, and we're here for each other. So go ahead and make phone calls, call family, call friends, call me, call each other, pray, read a good book, Here's an idea. Celebrate communion as a family on Good Friday. We'll be sending you some instructions as to how you can do that. And I want to call to mind, just to remember those words of Winston Churchill again. When you're going through hell, remember to keep going. So in the middle of all the self-quarantining and the restrictions placed on us in these days, I also want you to remember to rejoice. Jesus said, I will never leave you or forsake you. Other people may do that, but Jesus never will. You are not alone, even when you are called to self-distance. Here's the good news. God never self-distances. Scripture says he is as close to you as your very next breath. See you at our prayer time at 11 o'clock.